The Chicago rain in April 1934 was not a cleansing force, it was a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the city soot into a slick, black lacquer. It clung to the brickwork of the North State Street tenements and gathered in the gutters like liquid shadows. For John Dillinger, sitting in the passenger seat of a stolen Hudson parked half a block away from the State Congress apartment building, the rain was a veil, a thin, shimmering barrier between the man he was and the ghost he was becoming. His aura, once a radiant shield of invincibility that had carried him through the gates of Crown Point, now felt heavy and dark, a suffocating weight that pressed against his chest with every breath. His face was a map of fresh trauma, a landscape of purple bruising and jagged, weeping stitches from the surgery that was supposed to make him invisible. Instead, it made him feel like a stranger in his own skin, a gargoyle hiding in the theater of his own life. Beside him, the air in the car was thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of the Colt .380 resting on his lap. But his mind wasn't on the weapon, it was on Evelyn Billie Frechette. To the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the relentless Melvin Purvis, she was merely Dillinger's mole, a tactical asset to be exploited, a pawn in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. But to John, she was the only thing that kept the public enemy from becoming a hollow shell. She was his North Star, the woman who looked past the headlines and the wanted posters to see the man who still loved the simple quiet of an Indiana farm. She was a woman of Menominee and French heritage, carrying a quiet strength that mirrored his own, and tonight, that strength was being led directly into a trap. The aura of the street shifted suddenly. It wasn't a sound, but a change in the static of the night. Dillinger's eyes, still bloodshot from the surgery, narrowed as he watched the apartment entrance. He saw Billie approaching, her coat collar turned up against the damp chill, her movements graceful despite the tension he knew she must be feeling. She was supposed to be meeting a friend. But the air felt wrong. The shadows near the entrance weren't just shadows, they were the silhouettes of men in trench coats, their hats pulled low, their hands buried in their pockets in a way that signaled hidden steel. These were Purvis's G-men, the new breed of hunters who didn't care about the rules of the street, only the results of the hunt. Dillinger's hand tightened around the grip of the Colt. The impulse to scream her name, to throw the car into gear and roar onto the sidewalk with his Thompson submachine gun spitting fire, was a physical ache in his limbs. This was the price of love in the world of the outlaw. If he stepped out of that Hudson, his distorted face would be recognized instantly. Even through the rain and the bandages. He wouldn't be saving her, he would be inviting a massacre. He was a man who had mastered every escape, but he could not escape the reality that his very presence was a death sentence for anyone he touched. He was forced to watch, paralyzed by the lethal logic of his own legend, as the trap snapped shut. The agents moved with a practiced, predatory efficiency that echoed the grim scene outside the Biograph Theater. As Billie reached the door, 3 men stepped from the darkness. There was no polite request, no hesitation. They swarmed her, their movements violent and jarring against the quiet rhythm of the rain. One agent grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back, while another snatched her handbag and tossed it to a third. Billie didn't scream. Even from 30 yards away, Dillinger could see her spine straighten. She held her head high, her aura remaining defiant even as the law sought to crush her. She knew he was out there. She knew he was watching from the dark, and her silence was a shield she was holding over him. The humiliation of the arrest was visceral. They shoved her toward a waiting black sedan, the same type of heavy, authoritative vehicle that would later haunt the streets of Chicago. Dillinger felt a tear track through the grime on his cheek, stinging the surgical incisions that refused to heal. He had outrun the police in 5 states. But he couldn't outrun the cowardice he felt in that moment. To save his own life, he had to let them take hers, at least for now. As the sedan's engine roared to life and it disappeared into the rainy gloom, the street felt suddenly, terrifyingly empty. The king of the outlaws was left alone in the dark, his heart a cold stone in his chest, realizing that the FBI hadn't just taken his woman, they had taken his soul. The hours that followed were a descent into a private purgatory. Dillinger retreated to a secondary safe house, a cramped, 1-room apartment that smelled of mothballs and despair. He spent the night pacing the floor, his bandaged hands clutching a bottle of whiskey he didn't drink. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the agent's hands on her. He saw the cold, sterile interrogation room where he knew she was being held. The FBI, under Hoover's direct orders, was using a third-degree approach. They weren't just questioning her, they were trying to break her. They denied her sleep, they shouted at her, and they threatened her with years in a federal penitentiary for harboring a fugitive. Billie Frechette was subjected to days of psychological torture. The agents mocked her relationship with Dillinger, calling her a gangster's tramp and telling her that John had already moved on to another woman, that he was laughing at her from a hideout in the woods. But Billie knew the man behind the mask. She knew the Laura of the real John Dillinger, and she remained a stone wall against their questions. She wouldn't give them a single address, a single name, or a single hint of where he might be hiding. Her loyalty was a flame that the entire federal government couldn't blow out. Back in his hideout, Dillinger was disintegrating. The price of love was proving to be more expensive than he had ever imagined. He began to plan a rescue mission, a suicidal assault on the jail where she was being held. He sat at a small table, drawing maps of the police station with his featureless, burned fingertips. He cleaned his weapons with a manic intensity, the aura of the gentleman bandit being replaced by the frantic energy of a trapped animal. His crew, men like Babyface Nelson and Homer Van Meter, looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. They saw that the great Dillinger was no longer thinking with the cool, calculated logic of a master strategist, he was thinking with the raw, bleeding heart of a lover. "You go in there, Johnny, and none of us come out," Van Meter warned him, his voice low and grim. "They want you to try. It's a setup. They've got machine guns on every roof. If you go for Billie, you're just helping them finish the job." Dillinger didn't listen. He couldn't. The guilt of his own survival was a physical weight he couldn't carry. He felt that every second she spent in that cell was a second he had stolen from her. He looked in the mirror at his lumpy, stitched-together face and hated what he saw. The surgery hadn't made him a new man, it had made him a monster who had sacrificed his bride to the altar of his own vanity and fear. He realized that the FBI wasn't just hunting a man, they were hunting a symbol, and they had found the symbol's only weakness. The psychological warfare continued. The newspapers, fed information by the Bureau, began to print stories about Billie's confession, hoping to draw Dillinger out of hiding in a fit of rage. They published photos of her looking tired and disheveled, a stark contrast to the glamorous mole the public had come to know. Every headline was a dagger to John's spirit. He was witnessing the slow-motion destruction of the person he loved most, and he was powerless to stop it. The Laura that had once inspired millions of Americans to cheer for the underdog was now a dark cloud of regret that followed him into every room. In a moment of absolute desperation, Dillinger actually called the police station. He used a disguised voice, his heart hammering against his ribs, and demanded to speak to the officer in charge. He told them that if they didn't treat Billie with respect, he would turn Chicago into a graveyard. It was a hollow threat, the dying roar of a lion who knew he was caught in a snare. The officer on the other end laughed and told him that Billie was doing just fine, and that they were looking forward to meeting him soon. They knew they had him. They didn't need to find him, they just had to wait for the price of love to become too high for him to pay. Billie was eventually convicted of harboring Dillinger and sentenced to 2 years in a federal reformatory. When the verdict was read, she didn't weep. She looked toward the back of the courtroom, perhaps hoping to catch a glimpse of a ghost in a trench coat, but the room was filled only with reporters and agents. She was taken away to a prison in Michigan, far from the neon lights of Chicago and the high-speed V8s of the outlaw trail. For John Dillinger, the arrest of Billie Frechette was the beginning of the end. The spark that had driven him, the dream of a quiet life with the money they had stolen, was extinguished. He became a more dangerous man, but a less careful one. He began to take unnecessary risks, to show up at crowded baseball games and movie theaters, as if he were daring the universe to take him, too. He was a man who had lost his anchor, drifting toward a final, bloody confrontation that he no longer seemed interested in avoiding. The Laura of the man who walked out of Crown Point was replaced by the Laura of the man who walked toward the Biograph Theater. It was a darker, more somber energy, the energy of a man who knew the price of his life had been the freedom of the woman he loved. He had burned his fingerprints and sliced his face to stay free, but he had learned that the only thing more painful than being caught is being the reason someone else is in a cage. As he sat in a diner weeks later, staring at a cup of cold coffee, Dillinger touched the scar on his lip. He thought about Billie in her cell, and he thought about the road ahead. He knew the FBI was closing in. He knew that the next time he saw the trench coats and the fedoras, there would be no Hudson to hide in, no rain to cover his escape. The price of love had been paid in full, and all that was left was the final act of a legend that had become a tragedy. He stood up, adjusted his hat to that same rakish angle, and walked out into the night, a man who had finally realized that even the greatest outlaw in the world can't steal back the time he's lost or the heart is broken.